By an hour and a half into the entire nationwide invasion, which included the Battle of Austin, the Russian forces of the 207th Motor Rifle Division, which included their artillery forces of their 2S-19 MSTA self-propelled 152mm howitzer battalion, as well as their BM-21 Grad 122mm rocket battalion, had saturated massive target areas with their enormously potent concentrated fires of their munitions, as well as the maneuver elements of Russian combat engineers and mechanized infantry forces, which their troops were effectively equipped in very similar form and backed up to the hilt by the Russian artillery, their Lancet III loitering munitions, with an ISR constellation of squad-level quadcopter assets, which allowed them to map the entire battlefield in real time alongside of the high-altitude assets and the satellite overlays, as well as their squad-level NCOs carrying the PDA version of the combat data links, which always, constantly, by the second, updated enemy and friendly forces positions, including themselves, as the PDA combat data links acted as a transponder, with the artificial intelligence real-time battlefield data processing network guiding the AI target-seeking modes of loitering munitions such as the Russian Lancet IIIs or the Chinese CH-901As and others. These weapons were profoundly powerful and made an enormous difference on the ever-changing fluid battlefield, as these would seek out enemy targets and crash down upon them, annihilating them, and supporting their ground forces in the process. As Russian armor of their T-72 B-3Ms had effectively crushed the American armored forces of the 2nd of the 198th, the heaviest American combat formation in this battlefield, consisting of tanks, as they had Bravo Company, a tank company, as well as Charlie and Delta mechanized infantry, and they had their hotel company, which was their logistical and support elements, as well as also their headquarters, although Alpha Company was away conducting interoperability training with the 1st of the 200th in New Mexico. These forces were destroyed by the Russian armor of their armored battalion, moving in with their 2 tank companies, armored infantry company, one of 2, as they had 4 total tank companies, and they also had their anti-tank company of their BMPT Terminator anti-tank vehicles, although they took up effectively a rear security position during the fight against the American forces of the 2nd of the 198th, but the People's Armed Police, who had partaken in that battle as well, had utilized their anti-tank missiles like their HJ-08s, as well as also their flamethrowers like the 74 flamethrowers, and even vehicle-based fire and loitering munitions support to very potent extent, as well as also their artillery providing support to both their own forces and the Russian forces as well, as it was not uncommon for these allies to support one another, especially in terms of artillery or air power, as the dedicated Chinese combat drones, the Winglong 2 combat drones, had even supported the Russian forces in the combat that had occurred in Lago Vista, as by now, at 1:30 a.m., that combat had since wrapped up, and combat on the flanks in the eastern areas of the metro area was still ongoing at this very early hour, as again, it was just over an hour in to the entire invasion, an hour and a half exactly, as People's Armed Police combat battalions from the 43rd PAP Brigade were clearing the flanks and also conducting, whilst clearing the flanks, a very special capture operation in Del Valle. As they moved into the area, there was a certain senator that lived in a very large home in the affluent suburbs of this suburban area known as Del Valle. And as armed reactionary civilians who had been armed for some time due to the nation's failed border policies and the consequences thereof, causing them to have to take their own self-defense into their own hands, effectively meant that all the wealthy people were armed, and many of them rose up to challenge the invasion forces, although not fully understanding that they were no match whatsoever at all for them, as they lacked any effective anti-tank weaponry or anti-armor weaponry in more general terms, nor did they have any air defense capabilities, and they, most importantly of all, lacked communications and ISR capabilities, causing them to have to conduct primitive means of communications amid themselves, which involved earshot communications, as in yelling or spreading messages on foot or by vehicle to others, which could be very dangerous, as well as also line of sight communications, which could include everything from hand signals to flag waving and other types of visual signaling. And as a result of this, coordinating any type of defenses was absolutely of the utmost difficulty in terms of even at the local levels, as many people were not ready for this type of warfare, as this was high-intensity warfare wherein the artillery firepower, the missile firepower of tactical, ballistic, and cruise missiles, and other types of missiles, as well as also the air-based firepower, was simply immense, and the maneuver forces were large and powerful. And in this area, a single People's Armed Police maneuver battalion had moved into the wealthy, affluent neighborhood wherein they were trying to conduct this high-value individual capture operation. Again, because the coalition planned to have tribunals after the invasion had concluded, because they had wanted to hold the American leadership accountable for all of their past decisions. And this was to be broadcast to the world, as these kangaroo courts were, which what effectively they would be to hold these individuals accountable for the charges that they already had deemed them guilty of. As now, in this area, we go to the map in the neighborhood in question in Del Valle, and this neighborhood is full of large homes of affluent people living in this area, with the largest home in this area being this house right here, which had a sort of castle style to it, with a tower on the corner that had a sort of keep-like look to it, and it had a swimming pool and a pool house. This was, in fact, the senator's house. This was the main objective, apart from already clearing the flanks, which was the other objective, as any time armed reactionary civilian elements rose up, they needed to be crushed quickly. They should never be allowed to gain any form of momentum, according to the coalition leadership, and thus should be destroyed wherever they stood. And as a result of this, People's Armed Police 130mm artillery firepower was directed into this area as, again, as this operation was ongoing since the invasion had broken out. The fighting had already started in this area some time ago, as again, it was an hour and a half into the invasion, and by this point in time, from the People's Armed Police battalion that moved into this area from their CCP regime properties, had surrounded with some of their comprising companies this grouping of 250 armed reactionary civilians. As the People's Armed Police forces of each battalion were made up of 7 combat companies and their headquarters and support company, only 3 companies from the battalion were deployed into this area, as one company and its combat elements were moving in from the northwest. There was the other company's combat elements moving in from the northeast. And the third company moving into the area from the south. All of these companies, of course, leaving their headquarters platoons behind in star formations with their MRAPs providing security around the weaker vehicles, such as the logistical trucks, the command vehicles, which effectively were the company captain's vehicle, as well as the head NCO of the forces, and per each company. And of course, the fuel trucks, such as the MV3 fuelers, the armored recovery vehicles, and so on and so forth, which comprise the headquarters platoons. As the combat vehicles were, of course, the IFV, or Infantry Fighting Vehicle version of the WZ-551 wheeled armored fighting vehicles, and of course there were also the APC versions, which replaced the remote control 30mm autocannon turret, as again, the original 25 equipped some of these IFVs, although they also had upgunned versions with the 30mm autocannons, which equipped the 43rd PAP Brigade's IFVs. And as these were replaced with a machine gun turret with a W85 heavy 12.7mm machine gun on the APC versions, these combat platoons moving through this area were also heavily supported not just by their own artillery forces from the 130th PAP Artillery Regiment, which were firing their Type 59-I 130mm artillery pieces. These forces were also backed up to the hilt by their loitering munitions support in the form of their CH-901As and even a Wing Loon 2 combat drone in this area supporting these forces on the ground, as again, the Chinese had deployed 10 of their Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drones to this Austin battle space, as the Russian and Chinese air power was already immense for within a 20 by 20 mile area. To have 24 combat aircraft in such a small area was a large force indeed of air power. Not to mention the addition of the dedicated combat drones, numbering 10 of them, also added the ability to strike very precisely at smaller scale targets without having to waste any of the much more powerful air power in the form of the VVS or Russian Air Force combat aircraft or the Chinese PLAAF combat aircraft of their fighter aircraft squadron of their JF-17Bs earmarked specifically for this battle space. As the firepower in this area was destroying these mansions effectively, along with large groupings of armed reactionary civilians who were also being hit by other systems, such as the loitering munition strikes coming in from the CH-901A loitering munitions, which were devastating, as these were equipped with fragmentation warheads, as they were being used against groupings of infantry-type forces as it pertained to the armed reactionary civilians being effectively not heavily armored forces in heavily armored vehicles like tanks. These warhead types on the CH-901As, as the fragmentation warhead was made to produce maximum shrapnel effect, were the ideal weapon of choice for the fragmentation as it pertained to fighting infantry-type forces. Even if fighting regular military infantry-type forces, the fragmentation warhead was an excellent warhead type. Although, when fighting military elements, usually the HE, or high explosive, or the heat, which was high explosive anti-tank, were the best two warheads when fighting much heavier forces. But because these were simply armed reactionary civilians, as well as also them having soft-skinned civilian vehicles, or technicals essentially, pickup trucks and SUVs or other personal vehicles with armed men in them, these too were vulnerable to the fragmentation warheads, which could easily destroy a civilian vehicle as well. And as a result, these were highly devastating when they impacted these groupings of armed reactionary civilians as they frantically moved about the neighborhood, as confusion reigned in this battlefield because, again, there was no effective communications on the American side, no effective ISR capabilities whatsoever at all, except what people could see that was right before them. And oftentimes it was far too late, as the Americans were seen long before they were often able to see their enemies. As now, the People's Armed Police had their movements guided by their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets and their artificial intelligence real-time battlefield data processing network, which guided them on where and how to move into different areas in order to surround and destroy enemy forces, or split them up and destroy them in smaller groups, or so on and so forth, as the artificial intelligence system could not only tailor pre-prepared strike packages, but also guide forces in their movement while crunching various domains of data, which even included terrain data, street data, and more as it pertained to urban areas. And all of this used to guide the forces in their movements, making them absolutely devastating in combat. As this Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drone is firing CM-502KGs, which were a very overpowered missile considering what they were firing at. They were firing at this grouping of armed reactionary civilians running through this area, as these forces of this platoon now moved into this area and were exchanging fire through this wooded area here behind this house, with armed reactionary civilians that were running into this area and running down in this direction and in this direction, exchanging fire with these PAP forces laying down in the prone position, firing with their QBJ-201 light machine gun, their riflemen, including firing 35mm barrel-fired grenades from beneath some of the QBZ-95s of a few men that possessed those, rocket-propelled grenades of the Chinese Type 69 RPGs, which also had the anti-personnel warheads, or rockets effectively, which were being fired into these personnel running this direction, as well as all of the small arms fire. And 2 loitering munition strikes would come into this area, which is why this green arrow is surrounded completely in red, and this arrow is surrounded completely in red, as is this one, with these missiles hitting, and these missiles hitting this area, loitering munition hitting this technical. Also, the fire coming in as this squad moves to the side of this house and exchanges fire with all these forces, briefly getting return fire, but not for long, as these missiles, loitering munition strikes, and artillery all pound this area and completely annihilate it. As there is a lot going on this map at the very opening. The high-value individual capture mission itself would be occurring in this house, the largest house in the neighborhood, as mentioned. This is the senator's house, right in this area here. As the troops of this platoon were tasked with the capture of the senator, as well as also eradicating some of the wealthy neighbors that took up position in his house to help defend it, because they viewed it as a type of fortress, as it had a castle-like appeal to it and design to it, and was made of stone as well as also brick everywhere, which was very strong building material against small arms fire, but not necessarily against 12.7 millimeter anti-materiel fire, especially if fired into a single area for a prolonged amount of time, which would shred through the building material eventually if it was stone or other material, as well as also the autocannon fire, which could shred right through the walls as well. Nonetheless, however, though, small arms would be the only allowed weaponry to be used against these forces because, again, they wanted the senator alive. They were not going to destroy this house by any means. So they sent in, after this squad here used their Type 74 flamethrower from their flamethrower-equipped soldier, burning these forces as loitering munition strikes came in and hit them, along with vehicle-based fires, multiple systems hitting this column all at the same time. Small arms, flamethrower, heavy machine gun fire, autocannon fire, and coax fire from beneath the IFV, the 7.62 by 54 millimeter, loitering munition strikes, and more. It was devastating. These two fighter aircraft of JF-17Bs were flying over the area in case there were any requests for any badly needed air support, but none would be asked of these forces, and they effectively had everything under control between the artillery, firepower, loitering munition strikes, and even their Wing-Loom 2 dedicated combat drone firing their CM502KG missiles, dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missiles, with their vehicle-based fire powers as well, were more than enough to handle this situation as it was developing. As this vehicle moved up, and these vehicles moved up slightly as well, this squad went in to clear this building before moving out of the garage and taking up position on this corner. As this vehicle moved up through the middle, as per SOP for clearing buildings, the vehicles and/or troops moved up alongside of those that were within the buildings, clearing them. As this squad went in to clear this house, they would then come out the back and take up position and briefly exchange fire with these forces moving here that were getting hit by loitering munition strikes, as well as laying down fire against the upper floors of this house here, while this giving covering fire to the squad as it ran into the ground level and breached and went in to clear the building. The vehicles, too, would fire heavy machine gun fire in until this squad had successfully breached, and this vehicle would move up along with this squad here, bounding and covering tactically, along with this double column squad clearing this house and then moving in to clear this house. They would take position in this house and fire from outside the house, getting return fire from these personnel, including these personnel moving into this house and firing back and forth with the squad here that, after clearing this house, had went into this house. Loitering munition strikes destroyed these vehicles, with also heavy machine gun fire from 12.7 millimeter fire, as the house here was simply annihilated by ISR-directed shell fire coming from the Chinese artillery forces, firing their very potent 130 millimeter howitzers, as again, if these were ever fired in concentrated form, they were absolutely devastating on targets, like what was being done in this area with all of these impact markers of imminent strikes. As we open up the map, all of this is hitting this area, destroying all the vehicles and everything that's beneath the blast icons themselves, like these houses and those that were inside of them. This vehicle destroyed as well by artillery fire, as a lead IFV is also firing into this area at the same time as artillery's impacting. This squad moving down through the back of this area had just burned this house down with their flamethrower, using their Type 74 against that house, catching it on fire, causing people to flee and burning them in turn as they bounded into this area beside this wooded area that separated the backyards of these homes, using their Type 74 flamethrower soldier to burn these forces, as also they would be hit by loitering munition strikes, as this grouping right here had red around it because they were being engaged, while this grouping was destroyed immediately. But the arrow that's covered in red, meaning they were all destroyed, this group right here, was hit by the loitering munitions as well as the small arms fire from the squads that moved here and here, firing at them from their positions. There was also the vehicle-based fire vectored into them. Again, angle and traverse and vectoring of fire is always very important and is guided by the artificial intelligence real-time battlefield data processing system through use of the ISR capabilities, which it uses to guide the forces on their fire and angle and traverse of such, as well as also calling in fire support operations and more. As these squads were moving to clear this house, this squad takes up position outside and cut these forces down right here, which is why they're already have red around them. They're already KIA'd, so were these forces before this fire was laid down with the loitering munition strikes, vehicle-based fires tearing through the wooded area, hitting the personnel here at the opening before the rest were cut down by the time they even made it here by these squads. This squad took fire breaching this house from the forces inside, and even this squad outside took a little bit of fire, but by the time this squad had gotten in, they had methodically gone through and cleared this house. The People's Armed Police would actually lose 4 of their troops in this battle, because when they would clear the houses, there would be some very rare instances where there would be very well placed traps in terms of fire traps from the positionings of certain armed reactionary civilian elements. But again, it would be very rare, and they would effectively have to get very good shots in certain places, like so, because hitting them in the vest was simply not enough, and it would barely do anything to these forces in most instances, as again, this is a much smaller target than is the core of the body. And hitting this is always more difficult than hitting this. And most of the time, they would never get so fortunate. But again, PAP would lose 4 troops in the house-to-house combat in this battle, because there would be some armed reactionary civilians who got some very lucky shots in. But again, 4 out of 3 different companies of 150 troops each is a drop in the bucket, as it was dispersed between all 3 of the attacking companies operating in this area. This mansion was annihilated by artillery. The rest of this gutted one, because it was gutted from the artillery hitting this area, was destroyed as these forces moved through the area. They too were hit by loitering munitions and artillery fires, which annihilated them. These vehicles were destroyed by artillery, finishing off this house here, as well as also loitering munition strikes and fire coming from this squad as it bounded and covered tactically. As this squad cleared this house, they moved to go and breach this house, while this squad, upon clearing this house, with this squad moving outside as per SOP for building clearance, taking position and laying down covering fire toward the windows of this building, while this squad went to basically breach along with this squad at about the same time. As that was happening, this squad was laying down fire. They cut these forces down right here, and they then moved to this position before this breach had occurred, and then they started laying down heavy fire into the back of the building as part of building clearance SOP. This squad that was now here would remain outside after they had assisted in the destruction of these forces right here with the loitering munitions, vehicle-based fires, and their small arms fire and flamethrower usage. They had then moved and taken up position for the main event, effectively speaking, which was the capture of the high-value individual, the senator, in his own house. As he had a panic room in here, they would eventually yank him out of there. They would breach that as well. As these two squads went through, they cleared this entire building, which had 35 armed reactionary civilians inside of it. The 4 that were outside in the backyard near the pool had been cut down by this squad moving into the area. And again, one of the 4 KIAs would result inside of this building here. And again, there would be another few in here, and there was even one in here as well. But again, the casualties were very light on the PAP side, naturally, and on the American side, extremely heavy. As these forces cleared this mansion very early on, and this squad came here again, exchanged very brief fire with these forces before the loitering munitions and CM502KG impacts, as well as vehicle-based fire, assisting these troops that moved here, cutting these forces down, as well as this squad assisting before they moved outside of this house here, while this squad went in to clear it after this combat had wrapped up here. As, again, there's so much activity occurring in this battlefield, all at nearly the same time or at the same time, just as would be in real life. It's difficult to show it all in a logical order, but is being attempted as always. As this squad moves outside while this squad clears this building, they then took up position outside upon having cleared it, maintaining their positions on this block right here, while their vehicles would wait right here as the artillery came in and saturated this area, destroying all these buildings, all these mansions. As again, the main priority as this squad cleared this house with this squad going in as well, while these vehicles waited outside as per SOP. This technical destroyed by the vehicle-based fires, heavy machine gun fire from the follow-up. Again, staggered weapons to provide full 360-degree security, mutual infantry and vehicle-based support. As they had staggered weapons, this vehicle shredded up with their heavy machine gun W85, this technical in the driveway of this mansion right here. As the squads went in to clear it, the firepower being utilized again was heavy. It was immense, as the autocannon-based fires, coax fires from the 7.62 by 54 millimeter, along with all of the CH-901A loitering munitions in use, the flamethrower usage from the Type 74 flamethrowers, anti-tank missile usage when needed from HJ-08s, which were very powerful, destructive weapons, and of course the riflemen and the tactical superiority of these forces moving in tactical teams with their weapons staggered, watching different directions as well, as they covered one another in multiple different ways as they fought as tactical teams as it pertained to these squads. And even when they broke up into stack teams, with each squad becoming half squads as they went into buildings, they fought with a high degree of professionalism and proficiency that just wasn't there on the American side. And they had much better weaponry. Most of the Americans lacked body armor. That was a major problem for the civilians that were armed. Most of them had not invested in any type of body armor. Although there was a fair number of Americans that had, there were still plenty that had not. And they were easily annihilated by the sheer volume of the small arms fire alone, much less the heavier firepower from the vehicles, like the 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire from the turrets on the APCs, or the autocannon fire on the IFV versions of the WZ-551s. Even the coax fire was devastating against many armed reactionary civilians who didn't even stand a chance against it, much less also the artillery-based firepower, as well as the combat drone-based firepower like the Wing Lung 2 dedicated combat drones firing missiles at their targets on the ground, as well as also, again, loitering munition strikes which were devastating, like these CH-901As, which were ubiquitous, nearly, and had been produced in gargantuan numbers, similar in many ways to how the Chinese Type 69 RPG had been produced in such gargantuan numbers it was unquantifiable. The forces were cut down with ease in these neighborhoods as the ISR capabilities of the Chinese guided everything from their angle and traverse of weapons to prevent friendly fire incidences, as well as also simultaneously maximizing their effectiveness, as well as also creating strike packages for the artillery and other forces, guiding the loitering munitions on AI target-seeking mode, even guiding the movements of the entire formations of People's Armed Police forces from their different company elements. The artificial intelligence system had revolutionized warfare that the Chinese possessed, and even the Russians also possessed, and had both ended up integrating for the purposes of this invasion, as China was the world leader in virtually all aspects of artificial intelligence, and Russia not very far behind them. These nations, integrating all of their capabilities, were at such a high degree of advancement that really there was nothing that could be done to stop these forces as they ran roughshod over America, and there was nothing that could be done about it, as the nation was being smashed by the artillery, the air power of the coalition, and missile forces, not to mention standard maneuver elements and what they were able to achieve as well. Massive total destruction. As building clearance was something that the People's Armed Police excelled in. Even regular military forces like the PLA and Russian Army did as well, but the People's Armed Police trained non-stop in this regard. And again, were like a form of combat dental floss in a way that could really get in there and do a lot of the nitty-gritty, up-close and personal type of combat, which included these types of situations when it came to building clearance. They were exceedingly fast at what they did, and they were exceedingly powerful in their capabilities. And this had shown throughout the areas of their responsibility as they rapidly annihilated their enemies in combat, including in very close quarters, such as within buildings and, of course, even outdoors as well. As the two squads that cleared this building had effectively annihilated all the defenders inside, as again, there were approximately 35 inside of the house, inside of this mansion, the largest one in this neighborhood here, which was the senator's house. they had gotten to the panic room and breached it and got him out and captured him alive. And he would be held in this position until the People's Armed Police vehicles rolled in to pick up the prisoner and remove him to the CCP regime property, upon which the headquarters battalion over the 43rd PAP was located alongside of the headquarters independent company of the 130th Artillery Regiment of the PAP, and of course their independent regimental level support company, which was also not part of any of the battalions, the firing battalions that made up the regiment, but was two independent companies effectively at the regimental level that were the command and logistical elements of the regiment. As the 250th National Construction Battalion had already reached the Austin Municipal Airport and would leave a company there and send the rest of the battalion to the Austin Bergstrom International Airport later. For the time being, the whole battalion would be in this location and preparing to convert it into a forward operating base. It would not be a FOB of the size of the Austin Bergstrom Airport, but it would definitely be a satellite FOB, much like what was going to be done to the Rusty Allen Municipal Airport in Lago Vista by the Russian combat engineers, who would also be constructing different outposts and forward operating bases as it pertained to this invasion and this particular battle within the invasion in Austin. As now the combat in Del Valle in this flank clearance operation would lead to yet more flank clearance operations by this very same battalion, they ultimately were rapidly achieving their aims within this area as, again, they were moving through like clockwork and were rapidly subduing their enemies and capturing vital objectives, which even included high-value individuals on the deck of cards for the central regime, among others. As the artillery played a decisive role, every bit as much as the loitering munitions and, of course, the Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drone firing its air-to-ground armaments against targets. The maneuver elements fought fanatically as well, as the People's Armed Police were a very brutally efficient combat force of what was tantamount to a paramilitary light elite infantry force for the most part, although they did have, again, some heavy track-based forces. Most of their standard forces were on the lighter end of using wheeled vehicles, whether IFVs and APCs or also other types. But for the most part, the People's Armed Police were a very capable fighting force, and their heavy forces, which were track-based, were even more powerful, such as their light tank elements and their very few regular armored elements that they possessed, which were their heaviest forces. But in the Austin battle, this standard People's Armed Police brigade was more than capable of achieving all the objectives set out for it, because again, they were a very elite, fanatical, Praetorian Guard-like element for the CCP regime, and sometimes fought more fanatically than even their PAP cohorts, their PLA cohorts rather, their PLA brethren, as the PAP was, again, a very elite force. In the next video installation, the capture of yet more high-value individuals including the Supreme Military Command that was visiting the cap building of the state cap, as well as the state regime leadership in the cap, would be captured by rapidly moving Russian combat engineer forces that were racing into the city from crossing their freshly laid PMP pontoon bridge, because about this time, as the flank clearance was going on here, they had just engaged and destroyed along I-35 another grouping of armed reactionary civilians before now moving into engage more before making it close to downtown, where they would then enter the downtown and effectively clear the area around the cap and send in forces to capture all the high-value individuals within it of their combat engineer forces, which were effectively, again, like elite assault infantry type forces, as they, in the Great Eastern European proxy conflict, were often sent in first to assault some of the most heavily fortified areas imaginable, and they did so exceedingly well, and had phenomenal capabilities in this regard. And all of these would be utilized in the fighting that would occur in the northern ends of downtown in Austin, as they would enter the area very soon and begin their operations to capture the cap structure intact, as well as the individuals inside intact. As the other Russian forces, including their armor, as they had 2 armored battalions within the 207th Motor Rifle Division, were already clearing the flanks just to the immediate southwest of downtown, west of it slightly as well, and would be moving south of downtown to clear additional flanks as they would make their way gradually to the I-35 area, where they would work together with mechanized infantry battalions in the area that would be moving in to assist in not just clearing these flanks, but also in the capture of a vital objective, the Austin-Bergstrom International Airport, as well as also I-35 being the most vital objective of all, for the sole purpose of it being the most important invasion route for the external components moving across the border and initially smashing their way in. This was the most important invasion route inland, as these external components would be racing fast and deep into the heart of America, all the way to Kansas before fanning out to assist the Trojans that were already there deep inland, doing much of the heavy lifting as it pertained to the external invasion prong moving up I-35 to get there. As there were other external invasion prongs moving up other invasion routes, the I-35 corridor was perhaps the single most important of all the invasion routes in the South Central invasion sector, although, again, there were other important routes, but I-35 split the nation right up the middle. And as forces moved down from Canada and others moved up from Mexico, they would meet in the middle of the nation as they fanned out, as it pertained to the externals, to relieve and also even reinforce the Trojans that were already there, again, doing the heavy lifting. That was the key essence of the fourth generation warfare doctrines, was the use of the Trojan shock armies taking the lead role instead of externals for once, and the externals were there to support them, as in moving in to back up the Trojans who were doing the main fighting. The Trojans took the lead role in fourth generation warfare doctrines. And these key invasion routes are absolutely vital to the success of this doctrine used against America, the target nation. More to come in the next video of this documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines in the invasion of America.